bit more. Come on, I woke up at 3 a.m. Yay! I'm excited to be here. I honestly wish Jeremy was here because I feel like he's like my cousin right now. Like we need to connect on some things. But I'm happy to be here, and there's times in which I give talks in which I talk a lot more about my journey and things that I've learned. This is a very short snippet of that. Usually I go deeper into like a longer process, but actually I'm going to center an epic failure that I had on my journey in pursuing diversity, inclusion, equity, and also provide like tips and outlines of how we can be better in this work. The title of my talk is Design No Harm, and really understanding this idea that for us to actually become empathetic, we first have to build our own humility, and yet we don't talk about that enough. And so I'm gonna dive deeper into that today. Oh, yes. So some of this you literally heard. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm very intentional about stating my pronouns because I want people to understand how they should identify me and also respect how others identify themselves. I also want to at least specifically call out one thing, which is this idea that I am a designer. And there's been times I've been in rooms in which people are like, oh, she's a social entrepreneur, she does work around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and they erase the designer piece. And that is problematic for me. One, I actually was technically trained as a graphic designer. I worked in that space, but that is not what I mean by designers now. When I think about design, I think about the reality that I can actually impact outcomes of not only myself, but also the community. That the systems in which we work in have been by design, and therefore they can be redesigned. And so when I think about the fact that I am a designer, that is part of my livelihood, that is my purpose, that is my being. And so I'm very much intentional around making sure that is not erased. So, why am I here? It was interesting coming to this space because sometimes I'm in a space with all 100% health professionals. Sometimes I'm in a space with 100% media professionals. And at our organization, we directly focus on 4 different sectors that we call narrative and livelihood shapers. These sectors impact our life expectancy, our quality of life, and the perceptions we have about ourselves and others. But yet we don't actually many times position them that way, even though they are extremely powerful. When you think about the reality of the education system, and that's where we learn a lot of our narratives, and I would argue our narratives of colonization and white supremacy, that is something that stands with us every single day. When we think about our health and healthcare system, and not just healthcare, but also like the social determinants of health, housing, all these other things, they impact our quality of life. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that every 7 minutes a Black person dies prematurely due to the effects of racial discrimination. This reality is an intersection of all of these systems. It is not just something that just someone said a derogatory term, and all of a something that's just impacting us, but it's our belief system, it's our actions, and many times our actions are also dictated by the actual perspectives and biases that we've learned throughout many different systems, okay? So I'm here to talk about empathy, and I like to start with a little tongue-in-cheek idea. Insert whatever profession you want. Many of them believe they are deeply empathetic. I'm going to say it again. When I go in the design space, they say, you know what makes us different? We're experts of empathy. When I go in the healthcare space, you know what makes us different? We're experts of empathy. When I go in the social work space, you know what makes us different? We're experts in empathy. And the reality is that none of us are experts of empathy. But yet we hide behind that because it makes us feel comfortable. And I would also argue it's a simplicity approach, like when you think of equality. If I give everyone $1,000, I feel great. But I'm not really thinking about what they actually need to survive and thrive. And it's the same with empathy. With empathy, if I'm just showing that I can walk in your shoes, which cannot happen, by the way, then, hey, I feel great. But that doesn't mean you actually understand the trauma and the history and the facts of healing that I have to continually go through when walking through life. And so I'm challenging this idea, and even in my own industry, I'm always the person in the front of the room like, oh, you're so cute. Bless your hearts, okay? Because I'm Midwest. We always say, bless your heart. And, this is a quote from one of the top design media outlets in which they say, empathy, you must know by now, is a major keyword in the design business. We empathize with our clients. We empathize with our employees and their customers. We empathize with outside experts, with humanity. I want to work in that field. And yet, I'm been asked many times to be in front of a lot of design rooms to talk about how we are falling short. And the reality, as humanity, we are falling short, and there's a lot more we need to do. And the first thing is actually raising our consciousness of the fact that we are falling short and being okay with that. And so this is an example of a design that has impacted us even to this day. So we're talking about my boy Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, I called him my boy. So look, I'm just saying, everyone, we all related, right? So we see here he created the two-track educational system. But let's call out this quote at the bottom where it says, scholarships would allow a select few from the laboring class to advance by, and I quote, raking a few geniuses from the rubbish. Now think about how that's showing up in our education system today. Think about how actually a lot of that has led to a lot of exclusion in our educational system today. But yet many of us are not raising our consciousness and honestly thinking about how in this moment he saw himself being very empathetic with certain communities. I would argue black people was not included in this, by the way. But that also means that he was not reflecting on his own humility and how his bias was leading to something that has impacted us throughout generations. Another example. These are examples from the traditional design space. How many people have heard of algorithm bias? As a darker skinned person, there's many times in which I am not captured by facial recognition software. There's actually been studies that found that actually was Amazon, they used essentially an AI system to filter through their applicants because they wanted more quote unquote diversity. But what they found is that the system was learning from our human behavior and therefore was actually taking out all of the women candidates. And so if there was any mention of a woman's college or any indication of someone being a woman, because most of the hires had been white men, they had pulled them out. Or how many people remember, what was it, Xbox Connect, I think it was? Bless their hearts. But with that game, before they had launched, they were pretty much at launch. One of the employees took it back home and they played it with their family. And they realized that the mother, it wasn't recognizing her movements, it wasn't recognizing the children's movement, but it was recognizing all of the kind of middle-aged men that were engaging with the actual software. Because they recognized also that only middle-aged men were the ones that were testing the software. And then these are different things that have been going out in our society. Or we can look at media as an example. And there's been many stories of this. This is one in particular that we talk about a lot. I actually am very much impacted by what they did in Parkland. I think they did fantastic work and continue to do so. I personally have been impacted by gun violence. I lost my 14-year-old brother to gun violence a little less than 2 years ago. So I commend the work that they are doing. This is not a downplay of what they're doing at all. However, when you talk about media recognition, we were recognizing the activists that were white passing opposed to the ones that were Black or other forms of people of color. And this is something that happens all the time. One of the most recent ones was when we had climate activists that were at Davos, and they had a picture of 5 women passing climate activists, and the only one that was cut out of the picture was the Nigerian woman. This is something, and when we see these narratives, we're not really taught to question them. It's just something that continually goes into our mindset, right? And like, this is the norm. And then last examples I wanted to show are some that are actually things that we see in our environment every day. The park bench at the top, any idea on why it may have been designed that way? So homeless people won't sleep on it. We usually, sometimes there's where we include a photo of actual spikes that are in the ground in corners, so homeless people can't sleep there. Also, one of my colleagues, our learning education manager, has really bad back problems, so she also can't sit there for an extended period of time. In St. Louis, we have this thing called the spheres. Apparently, this wasn't enough to have the spheres. They had to also put some blockades there, where you tend to see these in more affluent communities where they don't want certain community members coming through. What they found is that this actually had an adverse reaction where crime rate has gone up, and also emergency personnel can't get there because they've kept everyone out. And then also in St. Louis, our light rail system, I don't know how your light rail system is here. From a cousin in the Midwest, I can relate, okay? Our light rail system goes east and west. That's it. East and west. And when there's been efforts to try to go north and south, there's been a lot of pushback. St. Louis is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And if you look at our maps, actually, our racial division is north and south. And our Metrolink system also is following that, right? Is that here too? Like I said, we cousins all over, unfortunately. And so when I think about design, just to be clear, my slides are a little messed up, but I know all this by heart, but we're good, so pay attention to what I'm saying too. The way that we define design is the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. IBM defined design as the intention behind the outcome in the 1960s. We expanded upon that definition because, honestly, your intentions are not enough for me. As someone that grew up in a historically underinvested Black community, we heard a lot of good intentions, but no one was holding themselves accountable on the impact that they were having in our community. And when we are doing work in our community, we have to consider the sources and impacts of exclusion and inequities within our designs. The National Equity Project in Oakland says that any system produces what it was designed to produce. I wanted to show this image because this is actually from a video on YouTube. It's called What is Social Innovation? It's done by the Center of Social Innovation in Canada. I love the video. I recommend checking it out. In this video, it talks about the different systems that impact us every day, the systems that show up, our government system, our health system, our transportation system, even our systems of just community connection, whether it's our businesses, our schools, our family, right? But while a lot of these systems have been by design, there's other systems that's also been by design. Systems of exclusion, systems of isolation, systems that are so interconnected that sometimes we don't even know where to begin. And these are systems of discrimination, of homelessness, of poverty that impact us every single day. But we love to talk about these systems because it makes us more comfortable. And so at our organization, we say just like all designs, systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design. But that also means that they can be redesigned. We don't just sit in this state of, well, it is what it is. I mean, when I'm dealing with my husband, sometimes I say that. But when I'm talking about this, it's not it is what it is. Because if we had the power to design these systems in this way, that means we also have the power to design different systems. And we need to understand the co-responsibility that we have to do that. But we first have to understand that to build these systems, we have to analyze our own humility and our ability to actually be empathetic. So I'm going to quickly go through this a little bit. So empathy is not just a word. I know we love to put it in our value statements. I see diversity and inclusion in the value statements as well. Oh, my favorite is equity. And it's like, how do you have equity when you don't even have diversity? But we love to put it on paper. But empathy is not about words, it's about action. It's about what we're actually doing. But we need to understand that empathy without humility shows up differently than empathy with humility. So here's what I mean. Empathy without humility many times shows up as judgment. As someone that was a former Ferguson resident, we saw this a lot around the uprising in Ferguson. There was a lot of judgment on why certain things happen. And many times that also led to justification on why certain things happen. How we can justify people losing their life, I still don't understand. But yet some reason we find a way. It also leads to us thinking that intention equals impact. And it doesn't. Not unless you're intentionally doing the work and measuring the impact and understanding that it's not just from your perception, but the perception of the people that you are engaging with. Because if you are telling yourself, ooh, I'm impactful, sweetie. Ooh, I have humility. Those are usually the ones you're like, how are you humble? Also, empathy without humility many times means that we remove ourselves from the equation. We look at it as if it is an outside engagement and action, but we need to understand that if we are not intentionally designing for equity or inclusion or belonging, or I would prefer liberation, many times we are designing for inequity, for exclusion, for lack of liberation, because that's what we've been taught. Again, it's not something that we just wake up and like, I'm going to design for inequity today. But it's just what we have been brought upon. And so it requires intentional work around this. But we need to understand if empathy doesn't have humility, then ultimately it's still about you. Okay. But humility is much more than being humble. We asked a friend of mine in Missouri, she works at the Missouri History Museum, to think about what humility meant for her. And she said that humility asks us to step outside of ourselves, listen, and absorb someone else's truth, even if it makes us feel defensive. Even if it makes us feel defensive. I personally believe that if you're in a room in which you are always comfortable, you are in the wrong room. Because discomfort leads to growth. Now, you should have, of course, a degree of understanding when discomfort leads to trauma. Not encouraging that. But also, is it trauma that has been manifested or trauma that actually is systemic? So there's a lot of things going in that, but I need you to understand that discomfort is where we learn. It's not when we're just all saying, I agree with you. Because in the communication theory, we talk about groupthink a lot. Groupthink is not helpful for any of us. So empathy with humility looks like acknowledging the role of self in every act. It looks like discomfort. It looks like admission of the role you're playing in the act. We admit a lot in my office. We talk about white supremacy. We talk about colonization. We talk about our biases. We were actually looking to hire someone, and we went through this full process, and we do work around equity. And it was between a man presenting candidate and a woman presenting candidate. And we were towards the end, and then we sat, and I was like, wait, let's look at the words that we have underneath each candidate. We just fell into the stereotypes of each candidate and started to question their credibility based on, ooh, he's strong. Yet she's too inflexible, right? And these were two black candidates. But it was still something that we had to take a step back and say, start over. We had to start over and try to bring in other people that will challenge those biases that we brought in. So it's an ongoing process. Also, empathy plus humility means learning together. And beyond learning together, also sharing power. Because if we are not sharing power, what are we doing? And there's always power in every space. Power is a neutral term. But power is about how you wield it and how you yield it. And so if we are not constantly also analyzing how power is showing up in the space, either we are sometimes overexerting our power onto others, or others are overexerting our power onto us. And some of the things we talk about at our org is having people analyze their power and asking, when is my power helpful? And when is my power harmful? And what should I be doing around that? So if empathy has humility, then it's about us. It's not just about you. I called this out on Creative Reaction Lab's about to be newly launched website. That's what I'm going to after this. Founder work never ends. But the important pieces to pull out is to examine how our own identities, values, biases, assumptions, and relationships to power and privilege impact how we engage with ourselves, each other, and the communities we work with. What are some examples of what it looks like in real life? Discussing race publicly and within teams and projects. Race and ethnicity are social constructs, but they're social constructs that have impacted us deeply. Even the idea of what racism is. Racism is a public health issue. It's not just zip codes. So there's so much to discuss there. Also, we need to understand that we have to note our personal assumptions, our privilege, our power, and identity when interviewing others. Because it shows up. If you come in with an agenda, you already are setting this up where you are essentially extracting and not actually collaborating and co-creating. I tell people all the time, if you're working with community, please stop looking at community members as research subjects, because they are not here for your education. They are not your Google. And at the same time, if you are getting paid for something, they should get paid as well. And so in all of our budgets, we actually write a line item called the Living Expert Stipend, because we view community members as living experts of the day-to-day impact of whatever issue you're looking to address. They should be paid just like we're paid. And so we're very considerate of that. What are some questions to consider? What assumptions and biases do I have about the people and communities impacted by whatever project or effort I'm leading? Also, what assumptions have we built into our metrics of success? And I would also have you challenge the idea of who defines success. Are you actually having the community define it? Oh, sorry, did you get it? You get it? Okay, all right. So ultimately it starts with you. See, they mistake is they ain't give me no time. So I wanted to quickly show an example when I messed up. So this was maybe 2-3 years ago. I put a post on Instagram. I went to a conference. I was speaking at the conference. And they had the setup of, most people have photo booths. It's like a thing now. But they wanted to be different and have an old school photo booth. And I'm like, okay, let's get into this. Like, everyone's photo looks all nice. I'm going to do it. So I go and I take my photo, and you could barely see me. Like, what you see here is like flash, gleam, modified. You could barely see me. And I had put on my Instagram story that it is still upsetting that even something as simple as photography has excluded people of color. However, what I put on my main Instagram was a statement that I should, quote unquote, stay out of the sun. And so a colleague of mine says, please stay in the sun. Nothing wrong with being darker, just use sunscreen. Right? So I'm like, excuse me? Because again, I'm talking about my failure here. We need to have more vulnerability in this work if we're actually going to do it. So I came back and I was first trying to explain, this is what I meant. That wasn't my intention. But again, I wasn't thinking about what was my impact. And so we ended up having this dialogue, and essentially my colleague called me out on colorism. She called me out on colorism. And, we're going back and forth. I even did I have sisters that are darker. And you hear it all the time. They're like, I have black friends, right? And I pulled it also. We do it as well. Like, let me be clear. White supremacy is not just something white people have. Like, we all people of color also deal with this as well. There's a narrative in which we all been taught. And so I was trying to justify so hard that I did not mean this. And I have darker skinned individuals in my life. I would never And actually I think it was important to call out that she said it's an unconscious way of internalizing and normalizing anti-blackness, right? That's my girl. That's my sis. No, I love her to death. I do. And so this was the moment when I essentially pulled do you know what type of work I do? I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know what I'm talking about. Because, and I'm going to tell you now, someone that's been in this industry a long time, many times we're actually worse at it than everyone else. Because we don't have humility. And so I was all about, but I know what I'm doing. It was bad, y'all. It was bad. And so ultimately I ended up going back to the post, and I kept the post, but I modified it. Like, it took me a while. At first I was pissed. Excuse my friend. I was mad. I was like, what? But then I had to sit and reflect, and I recognized that I actually created harm. And that I was exhibiting anti-blackness and colorism, and it was something that I needed to unpack, and that was part of my journey. And so I went back and modified the post, and even today I went and read the post again, and I'm going to go and modify it again because I don't like how I wrote it. Because I wrote it like, if any of you were offended, I apologize. No, you apologize because you were wrong. And so I'm going to go and edit that after this. But this is something that it's an ongoing journey. Like, building empathy is messy and it's complex. And it's not something that happens overnight. And so I'm going to leave you with these last tips because I know I don't even want to look. I know she's staring at me like, shh, be done. Okay, last tips. I'm going to say them fast. Understand your power and responsibility to design perspectives and outcomes. These are things I want you to take away. Also, appreciate and amplify living expertise equally, if not more, than professional expertise. And I would also argue academic expertise, not just professional. Also, don't design in ivory towers, but live and immerse yourself on the ground. And guess what? Your phone and your computer also is an ivory tower. Be very conscious of that. Come on, I'm on time. There we go. Question your proximity to power and ask, should you step in? And I know that's ableist language, and we're trying to find another way of saying that. Or center others. Also, value the act of building trust and remove agendas. Because if you don't have relationships, it's just transactional, and there's no actual power being built collectively together. When people from historically underinvested communities speak, listen first before questioning. I also want to add, sometimes you shouldn't even just question. Sit and reflect in it, okay? And I will note, I tend to say historically underinvested over minority, over vulnerable, over marginalized. I think a lot of times in those statements we are blaming the communities that have been historically underinvested. And so I'm very intentional of thinking about the systems that have impacted the community. So I just wanted to give that caveat. Also, acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning while doing, and equally so is everyone else. Jeremy just spoke to that, right? Oh, you got it? Okay. Normalize statements of I don't know, because we don't. And understand that perfectionism is a form of white supremacy. Shout out to Dr. Kira Banks, okay? Also, time constraints is a form of white supremacy as well. Need to let that go too. Sorry about that. That was not intentionally to them. I always say that. Start and follow through. In 2014, I removed all my New Year's resolutions and gave myself one, and it was follow through. And that's what stuck with me since. And then I wanted to leave you on this quote in which it says, design is not about making things look good, but making things work. And we need to ask ourselves, who are we designing with, not for, but with? And who are we making things work for as well? And so thank you for your time. Talk to you later.